Let's talk about Birmingham in 63. So we got to talk about Martin Luther King. There were strides that were made through a lot of his protests, but they're going to focus now on marching throughout the South, trying to get segregation to end in public facilities, all public facilities, as well as increasing voter registration and voter participation among the African American community. Governor Wallace here, he's an interesting fellow. He ran for governor or ran for president a couple times. He's actually shot and confined to a wheelchair, and he's another one of those that, like, later down the road, after all this was done, he apologized for his role and what he said and his actions during this particular time period. So I don't know if it makes him better. It's just something to note, that later on down the road he kind of recants what he says here. So the goal, as far as these movements go, to bring attention to segregation. The police, and actually this picture on the right before I go forward, if you are interested, I know some of you guys, my history nerds out there, I have a few of you, Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History did a whole podcast, like a 40-minute podcast on this particular picture, and it's really interesting because this picture is not what it appears to be, and it's kind of cool if you listen to it. I believe they also did one on maybe Selma as well. Anyways, definitely go and look at this. It's interesting. Actually, I want to say he did a whole like mini series on the civil rights movement, and it's really interesting. It'll hold your interest if you're bored. And if you're not bored and you just like history, go look it up. Malcolm Gladwell, Revisionist History. It's one of the episodes. The descriptions will give it to you. All right, so the goal is to bring attention to segregation. Keep in mind the police was organized or allowed to use dogs, fire hoses, and brutality to break up the demonstration. And the reaction is outrage over the violence that happens. King is actually arrested in this particular protest as well. He was arrested many times, but this is another example. What's significant is that he writes a letter from a Birmingham jail that kind of gives us insight in terms of like what he's thinking and how he organizes the movement. A lot of you have probably read this in English class. It's popular reading. I know I did. Actually, I did in college. White America, for the first time, actually saw this happening live on their televisions, and it outraged them, especially people that didn't live in the South and wouldn't have seen this on a regular basis. They were able to see it in their living rooms, and that really helped spark outrage in those communities to try to, gain support to stop this from happening. People were concerned that Kennedy, was losing control. The government was losing control. And so Kennedy, in order to do something in reaction, again, reactionary, not proactive, he does order a new civil rights bill to be created, which leads us to the March on Washington. To show support for that, King decided, okay, we need to go march on Washington in order to show our support for this law that's going to be passed. So 200,000 plus, that's an estimate, demonstrators actually flocked to DC. Both African American and whites went there to show their support. This is where King gives his I Have a Dream speech in the front of the Lincoln Memorial. And finally, it is passed. The difference is, and look at the date here, Kennedy dies in November of 1963. So he is not the president to sign this into law. It's actually Johnson. You can see that on the bottom. LBJ signs the Civil Rights Act as Martin Luther King watches. This banned segregation in public places. It also allowed for affirmative action. Affirmative action is a policy that favors people who have suffered discrimination, minorities, especially African Americans in this case is what it was designed for originally, but it also is any minority, women, Asians, Latinos, anyways, Native Americans, are allowed to get kind of a boost. In other words, a lot of times they set quotas in terms of employment. Like you can't have a company that has all white workers or all male workers. You have to make sure that you are also hiring other minority groups. It originally started out as education, but there was a Supreme Court case that stopped that to where you cannot use race or ethnicity or gender as the only criteria for attending a specific school. That was the University of California versus Bakey Supreme Court case. 1964, they also passed the 24th Amendment, which stopped poll taxes in elections for federal officials. And then keep in mind still, voter turnout was poor. So in March of 1965, because of the Voting Rights Act of 65, there was a protest organized by King to march in protest of the fact that African Americans could not register to vote in the South. And that's what they were demanding. Again, if you have not seen the movie Selma, it is excellent. I highly recommend it. Very interesting. And then in 1968, again, this is 3 years later after Selma, Martin Luther King is still active. There's been a lot of legislation that's been passed. a lot of significant legislation. He's actually working here to help support a strike of sanitation workers. So working like on the employment level to help. He actually stood on his balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, and was shot and died. Here's right after the shooting, they're pointing the direction of where it came from. This is Loretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's wife, at his funeral. And then this here is the man who shot Martin Luther King. His name is James Earl Ray. So keep in mind, like we said, the civil rights movement, one of the significant parts about it, not only, you know, advancing African Americans, you know, in you know, promoting them, helping them get ahead in life, stopping discrimination. But this idea of, hey, if you protest, you can gain more, you know, recognition, more rights, more opportunities. There's other groups that looked at this and said, you know what, we're treated, you know, in an inferior way as well. And those groups, we're not going to look at all of these, but these are the groups that all of these have movement. Asian Americans, women, Native Americans, homosexuals, people with disabilities, as well as Hispanics. We're going to look at a few of these groups, the main ones, but we don't have time for all of them. So the women's liberation movement, Betty Friedan that we talked about in the 50s, it was written then, she actually pushed, or her book actually starts this whole movement. She wanted a greater emphasis on making sure that women had a role in society. She wanted improved health care. She wanted abortion legalized. They wanted to stop, you know, inequality from happening between women and men. They outlawed gender discrimination in the workplace. They wanted a greater increase in women's political influences, you know, more women in the Senate and in Congress, a female president, as well as, like we said, Roe versus Wade is another what a lot of women see as a, you know, success. Again, a new feminist movement in the 60s. You can read all these buttons. I'll leave that up to you. Feminism is the idea that men and women should be equal politically, economically, and socially. It starts in the 20s, but gains momentum in the 60s. So keep in mind, by the 60s, women are resentful of old stereotypes. You know, get back in the kitchen and make me a sandwich. They're not happy about that. They wanted a change. So you can see over here, freedom trash. They're actually burning bras and high heels in those trash cans. They said they were torture devices created by men. Eleanor Roosevelt actually urged Kennedy to look at women. Here, she's got her bra, she's gonna burn it. Those things are painful sometimes. 1966, Betty Friedan, like we said, believed that there was time for a women's movement, National Organization for Women, or NOW, as the acronym says. And they looked at issues that faced women. They wanted greater educational opportunities. They wanted women to, you know, be included in all professions as well as political positions. They protest the Miss America pageants. They still actually do that as well. And some progress. They do get the Equal Pay Act passed. They also, the Civil Rights Act actually outlawed job discrimination based on sex. And that will become the basis of this movement. Keep in mind, there still is inequalities, or still are inequalities in pay that exist to this day. Another, excuse me, another piece of legislation that was passed is Title IX, Title IX. IX is Roman numeral, 10 is the Roman numeral, or X means 10. And when you put the I in front of it, that means you subtract one. If the I is after it, that means you add one. Just a little math lesson there. Title IX makes sure that colleges really, and let's just say public schooling, because it's also in high schools as well, that they do not discriminate against sports. So for women, so if they're offering, you know, 10 sports for males, they have to have, you know, something that's close or the equivalent for women. So you can't have 10 sports for guys and, you know, the girls can only be cheerleaders. It has to be equal. You have to spend the same amount of money on those programs as well, proportionately, like per athlete. So keep that in mind. The Equal Rights Amendment has been introduced into every session of Congress between 1923 and 1972, and it has failed. They have not been able to get an Equal Rights Amendment, an ERA, passed. It came very close in 1980. It fell short. 3 more states were needed in order to get a constitutional amendment that stated that men and women were equal. Not all women felt that having men and women being equal was acceptable. Phyllis Schlafly actually fought against this. She said women, you know, basically should be happy being housewives. There are some women that are happy just being moms. There are some women that don't want to work. You know, you can't do this. If you read her quote there, it's interesting. Like women's libers is what they refer to, you know, the women's liberation movement. Roe versus Wade, another controversial decision. However, the feminist movement sees this as a positive step. I'm not saying that you have to. I'm just saying in terms of like feminism and the feminist movement in the 1960s, Roe versus Wade was in favor of what they wanted. It may, contradict your personal beliefs, but again, like I said, it's not necessarily my personal belief, but this idea of legalizing abortion is considered a positive for the women's liberation movement. There's a lot of, I don't know, different arguments about this. There's kind of three sides to this. Some people think pro-life, pro-choice, but there's actually a third. There's pro-life, pro-choice, and then there's some groups that say it's not the government's business, which is an interesting take. So I don't know where you fall. That's one of those things, as you get older and you start to vote, you got to really, hone in and pay attention. What do you actually believe when it comes to abortion? Because it's a big issue for a lot of people. Keep in mind, for shortcomings, the ERA still has not passed. Women continue to face discrimination and inequality and sexual harassment in many areas of unemployment. Think about the Me Too movement that was popular, just over a year ago. Government-sponsored childcare was never established, and also there is no federal requirement to pay women if they have a baby. So a lot of government or a lot of jobs will give some paid maternity leave, but it's not a requirement. Some will only pay a certain period of time, and then if you take a full 6 weeks, you don't get paid for it. Okay, United Farm Workers. Another movement, Hispanic Americans, especially in this area, fought for better living and working conditions, better wages, economic power, political power. There were migrant workers that were coming up from Mexico that were working in the fields, a lot of them like fruits and vegetables, and they were being paid like 20 cents to work 3 hours. And you can imagine way below minimum wage. And so a man by the name of Cesar Chavez actually organizes a boycott of grapes. They also boycotted Coors Light because beer companies, they buy wheat. That's how they make their barley and hops. That's how they make their beer. So they were protesting against those companies that were taking advantage of those farm workers. A lot of them are migrant workers and they move around. And so those migrant workers were not, being treated equally and being treated fairly. The living conditions can be very, very horrible in those particular areas. We have real close to where I'm from. We actually have migrant workers facilities, and they're really they're just not good. They're better than what they had back then. Sometimes they would have tents or nothing, but again, one of those things. It's hard. Let's talk about Native Americans for a second. Native Americans also fought against the government during this time period for rights. You can see up top, Red Power activists. This refers to Native Americans. They are successful in terms of getting aid for Indian aid programs. AIM, the American Indian Movement, became vocal for Native American rights, kind of comes to the forefront, draws a lot of attention. Native Americans are given more say in their reservations and education, although it's not perfect. If you remember back, a lot of you guys watched that TED Talks video on the discrimination that Native Americans face, and the conditions of the reservations are not good. They did win back 7 million acres in South Dakota and 1,800 acres in Rhode Island. But there are some shortcomings. Most Native Americans still live in horrible conditions. Alcoholism is prominent. Suicide numbers are very high. Poor health, high unemployment are also a problem. The groups actually occupied Alcatraz and Wounded Knee to try to draw attention to their movement. And they actually resulted in 2 Native American deaths as well as property damage. So this movement really didn't do a whole lot didn't do everything that Native Americans needed it to do for them. It's still not great for them and doesn't fix everything. I think that's an important thing to note. For all of these groups, these movements are not successful in every aspect. However, it does draw attention, and things are better than they had been previously, I guess is the best way to word that. Okay, guys, so we are done with that, and I look forward to talking with you next time. Thanks.